Good afternoon. I'm Lisa Carter, Vice Provost for Libraries here at UW-Madison, and I would like to welcome you to this exciting event featuring Dr. Eddie R. Cole in conversation with Kacie Lucchini Butcher about his new book, The Campus Color Line. This event is brought to you today by the Friends of the UW-Madison Libraries. The University of Wisconsin-Madison Libraries are so fortunate to have an active Friends organization that continues to provide opportunities for engagement even during a pandemic. Our wonderful friends bring visibility to our distinctive collections and the work of our libraries across campus. Tonight's event is just one example of the many ways the Friends support the research and scholarship done in our libraries. Not only are they putting on this event for us this evening, but they offered financial support which allowed Dr. Cole to do his research in our fabulous university archives just a few years ago. Speaking of our University of Wisconsin-Madison archives, I would like to introduce you now to our university archivist, Katie Nash, who will tell us a little bit about the archives and its role in supporting interesting research such as that which you will hear about tonight. Please welcome Katie to our virtual stage.
Thank you, Lisa. Hello, and welcome to everyone who's joining us today. I'm Katie Nash, and my pronouns are she, her, and I'm the University Archivist and head of UW Archives. The mission of the University Archives is to collect, preserve, and make available a variety of materials and documents that help tell the story of UW-Madison, including all the people, places, organizations, and so much more. In addition to collecting and preserving university history, we provide a variety of services and support cutting-edge research, the kind of research that is the foundation of Eddie R. Cole's new book. We not only support seasoned researchers like Dr. Cole, but also the work of student researchers. For those of you who don't know, we are located on the 4th floor of Steenbach Library, and we're usually open to the public when there's not a pandemic. So I encourage everyone to get in touch with me or any member of the archive staff if you have any questions or want to learn more. The Public History Project, which you will hear about shortly, plays an instrumental role in helping the archives and the university uncover so much about its history, especially as it relates to untold stories and marginalized communities. It is with great pleasure to introduce and turn the program over to Kacie Lucchini Butcher, the Public History Project Director.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today, and a special thank you to the Friends of the UW-Madison Libraries for putting this event together and for bringing Dr. Eddie Cole and I into conversation about such an interesting and important book. So as Katie said, my name is Kacie Lucchini Butcher, and I'm the director of UW-Madison's Public History Project. The project is a sweeping multi-year effort to uncover and give voice to the histories of racism, discrimination, and resistance at UW-Madison. We are researching the history of discrimination writ large at the university. This means the entire history of the university, over 150 years of history up until the present day. We're looking at discrimination broadly. We're looking at not only racial and religious discrimination, but also discrimination against LGBTQ folks and people with disabilities, international students, and others to get a full understanding of exclusion and resistance at the university. The project will culminate in a physical exhibit, a digital exhibit website, a lecture series, curricular materials, and many other forms of public engagement that will allow the campus community to learn about our campus history. We believe that by doing historical research, by bringing these stories to light, and by creating meaningful opportunities for our campus community to engage with this history, we can make UW a better place. In short, we believe our history matters, and we believe that our failure to recognize the more difficult, messy, and complicated history of our institution is keeping us from truly being a diverse and equitable campus community. That is why this project was created. Through archival research and oral history interviews, we are uncovering new stories and histories about UW-Madison all the time. Yet we know that we will never uncover every instance of racism or discrimination that happened here. However, we also know that at the end of this work, we will have a much better understanding of this university's history than what we began with. Works like the Campus Color Line are instrumental to our project's success. When we have access to high quality scholarship that focuses on UW-Madison history, it frees up our researchers to focus on other lesser studied or under-recognized histories. Finding Eddie's book and connecting with him about his research has furthered our understanding of the civil rights movement at UW-Madison, and specifically the ways that college presidents at UW-Madison were uniquely positioned during this period. Further, as a project, we like to focus on how history connects to the present. We are always asking ourselves questions like, what lessons can we learn from this history, and how can it shape our actions today? Eddie takes a similar framing in his book and in his work, and we hope today we can continue that conversation. So I'm going to introduce Eddie here before we bring him up. Dr. Eddie Cole is an associate professor of higher education and organizational change at UCLA and the author of the campus color line, College Presidents and the Struggle for Black Freedom. If you don't have a copy yet, I would highly encourage you to purchase it. Dr. Cole's research focuses on college presidents and their historic role in shaping racial policies and practices both inside and outside of the educational sphere. As a scholar of higher education history, his approach in covering historical material and making connections to the current critical context has garnered respect and praise from academics, as well as intellectuals and activists beyond the academy. His finesse in using extensive historical materials to address contemporary racial issues in higher education demonstrates the role of higher education in influencing all aspects of American life. Dr. Cole's scholarship and public writing has also been featured in the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. In 2021, he was named by Education Week as one of the, quote, top university-based scholars in the US who did the most last year to shape educational practice and policy. Dr. Cole has received numerous awards, including the 2018 Early Career Award from the Association for the Study of Higher Education and a 2017 Mellon Emerging Faculty Leader Award from the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation, which recognized him as a professor poised to, quote, play a significant role in shaping American higher education. We're so lucky to have Eddie here today in conversation with myself. So Eddie, please come to the stage and we will start our conversation.
Yes. Hello, Kacie. Thank you for the welcome.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to talk to you today. You and I have talked prior to this event and really connected. We're both kind of higher education history nerds. So I'm really excited that we get to have this conversation publicly and kind of bring everybody else into some of the really interesting histories at UW that we've got to talk about.
Absolutely. Let's do it. Let's talk.
Yes. So, throughout your book, I kind of went through and picked out some themes and some questions that I had for you and things that we've kind of talked about as interesting and things I think that will be interesting to our university community. So one of the themes kind of throughout your book, whether it's in the chapter that focuses on UW-Madison or the other institutions, is that university bureaucracy is kind of central in all of these stories. In fact, I think in highlighting so many different universities across the country, you paint a really clear picture of the ways that bureaucracy can often stand in the way of racial progress. And universities really seem to thrive on this bureaucracy. And that bureaucracy is often very hard for outsiders to understand. It's really inaccessible to outsiders, and it feels kind of immovable. Can you talk a little bit more about bureaucracy and how you see it as a barrier to social progress, and also what students and faculty and university community can do to fight against it or really fight within it?
Yeah. That's a good opening question. First off, let me just say thank you again for having me, and much love to the Madison community. I spent a lot of time there in the archive. So let me say that first. It's a pleasure to be back with you, although virtually and hopefully one day again in person. Now, when it comes to the question of bureaucracy, that certainly was a thing that emerged in doing the research for the book, but it wasn't something that I anticipated finding. And something that's clear throughout the book is that something we don't think enough about is sort of organizational charts and the hierarchy of decision-making being racist structures within higher education. And that really became clear to me as I went from campus to campus and looked at how the fight for Black freedom hit so many, points to where efforts were stalled, particularly on predominantly white campuses throughout from the 1940s through the 1960s. And one particular example, let me just start off our conversation, and I'll pick on UCLA. I can do that, right? And one example in UCLA is understanding the University of California system being a large, complex system in a large, complex state. And the structure of that system is there's a president over the UC system, and each campus has a chancellor. And one episode that I detailed in the book revolves around UCLA getting a new chancellor, Franklin Murphy, in 1960, and coming into the system and working with Clark Kerr, a notable figure in higher education history, known administrator who was the system president. And the two bumped heads quite often because the pace in which Franklin Murphy was willing to support Black students at UCLA and challenge discrimination both within campus and in the immediate neighborhoods such as Westwood community and Brentwood. To those of you familiar with Los Angeles, you know about what I'm talking about. And how often that Franklin Murphy as chancellor attempted to do things that the system would not allow to happen. And one example is when a number of people within the UCLA community, students and some staff, were arrested during the Freedom Rides in Mississippi in the summer of 61. And being arrested in Mississippi and having to make bail, one particular thing that students came up with was suggesting that the student government funds could be used to help their classmates, their peers, make bail money for this sort of civil rights exercise. But the University of California had very strict policies around students in the name of the University of California engaging with off-campus social issues. So you can imagine the tension between supporting students with funds from the student government regarding civil rights arrests in Mississippi, and Franklin Murphy wanting to support those students, but getting a lot of pushback from the system office and being able to do so. And again, that is just a quick example of how, thinking about how even when you have an administrator in place that may want to support students and the overall effort for Black liberation and education, you see these structures in place that slow down progress. And we can say the same thing for faculty too, Kacie. When we think about faculty governance and what's actually rewarded when you think about tenure and promotion, or just simply reappointment, whether tenure is involved or not, again, the structures in place don't necessarily reward mentoring or service that a lot of faculty may do for Black students on campus in exchange for how we think about what is rewarded in the sort of usual structure. So again, you see how structures in place and bureaucracy can slow down efforts that really are counterintuitive to what universities say they value around diversity, inclusion, and equity.
Yeah, that's a great point too about the hierarchies and like what that kind of, who reports to who and who actually has power, because I think that's one of the hardest things I know with student activists is they know what they want to change. And then they butt up against like, where do we even start? And there's no easy place to get that information. And then even when you think you know what that information is, they kind of get volleyed around a lot between a lot of different parties. So it makes it really hard to actually implement any of that change because, I mean, it feels like it's almost intentionally obscure.
It clearly is not coincidence, right? I mean, to a certain extent, when you think about the role of higher education within U.S. society, you can't separate higher education from other entities in U.S. history. And so when you think about, again, if we're going to talk about policies and practices, be it sort of governmental, at the federal or state level or municipal level, you have to also think about sort of the intentionality around those policies and the implications of those policies. And so you have to ask the same questions of universities as well, right? What about campus policies and practices? And how have those policies been implemented strategically, you could argue, throughout time, and what has that meant? So to the second half of your question about what can students do, for instance, to really navigate that sort of bureaucracy, part of it is learning the structures at place, but in reality, to move through bureaucracy, you need time. And so the advice I always give to student activists when studying, when I think historically about seeing the most effective activists, they've been able to pass on the demands and grievances that they have to the next academic generation. So students oftentimes may not see the change that they're demanding immediately, but certainly what we know from history, and the historians who study activism do this well, they always bring this up, about demands look eerily similar from decade to decade, right? If you were to redact the date, you say students, what they were demanding in the late 60s sounds a lot like what students were demanding in the late 80s and 1990s and what we saw since 2015, right? Some of the same issues are on the table. But ultimately, what happens is when the student gets toward graduation, they simply have to let it go and move on with their lives in a way that sometimes those efforts aren't completed that they started. But to truly get them to be completed and see a better campus environment for the next wave, sometimes navigating bureaucracy simply means being able to pass on and update the next group of students on where things left off so they can continue the conversation with administrators and faculty who will be on campus much longer than the traditional 4 to 6 years.
Yeah, I think that's a great point too, because what we see, I know at UW-Madison's history, is that oftentimes administrators will just wait out students. They'll say, you know what, like with the 1969 students, there was 13 demands that were issued in 1969 by Black students, and 3 of the 13 demands were agreed to be met. Only one of those demands actually was met and still exists, which is the Afro-American Studies Department, which celebrated its 50th anniversary last fall. But some of the other demands, like for example, a Black Student Center, as soon as all the 1969 students graduated, the center was closed. And so it seems like they're always kind of just waiting out and hoping that, they can wait out the graduation because administrators are here so much longer than students are.
Yeah, that's not only a Madison narrative, if you will, right? And that's why the demands stay so similar from decade to decade, or as I say sometimes, academic generation to academic generation. It's because the difference between making the demand, getting university officials to agree to said demand, and then getting university officials to actually implement to the demand, that's a significant amount of time possible. Even something like a Black Student Center, that's obviously not going to appear within 3 months. And 3 years will be quick as well when you think about sort of creating space and buildings and so forth. So again, it's just one of those things where you see this happen, and there's so much to learn from history, and that way we shouldn't be as shocked when we see demands come up again as well.
Yeah. So one of the questions I kind of had for you on the point of bureaucracy and like who has power, what these power structures are, is in the book, you focus a lot on housing discrimination, particularly in the Midwest. And that's one of my research interests. And in the book, you really detail in the chapter on the University of Chicago, their housing discrimination fight, and particularly how students were vocal about policy change, not statements or platitudes. And the same is really true at UW-Madison. Starting in the 1930s, students continually got more vocal about housing discrimination. And in the 1950s, students asked for a policy that would ban landlords from being on an approved housing list if they discriminated based on race or religion. And the regents ended up merely putting out a statement after there was like a faculty policy that was passed and the president had signed off. Can you talk more about if you think changing policy is effective, or how you've seen it be effective, and why that's kind of a better path to go down?
Yeah, that's a good question. I appreciate you sharing that backstory in your question, because there are some University of Wisconsin-Madison students who end up at the University of Chicago in a protest in January 1962, when those students at UChicago were upset about housing discrimination and its relationship to the university. So this Midwest connectedness from campus to campus is important, and this is a good question. As far as policy change is the only way to hold institutions accountable, right? It's one thing to say, issue a statement around what you believe, but at the end of the day, it comes down to policy. And when you're violating policy, that certainly helps administrators and others see the conflict of an issue at hand, a racial issue at hand, and what the university policy says about that issue. But when there's no policy, it's harder to sort of hold the institution and academic leaders accountable. So I do think policy change is absolutely important. And in the University of Chicago case, there was a sit-in in the president's office in January 1962 that went almost 3 weeks in President George Beadle's office. And that was notable too, because what students refused to do, they refused to leave the president's office until trustees agreed to a policy change. That was the turning point at University of Chicago, because like you said, issues around discrimination in major cities in the Northeast, the Midwest, on the West Coast, That goes back decades, well before the 1950s and 1960s. So that's an ongoing issue. But it wasn't until there was an actual policy change at the University of Chicago that there was some accountability to university officials to how they engage with racial restrictive covenants, to how they engage with landlords that discriminated on the basis of race. Once there was a policy change, that fundamentally gave Black students, local Black residents, not just students, Black staff, Black faculty, a different leverage in the conversation about talking about equality. Because if we can't talk about anything else in sort of the basics of being able to live within the United States, you got to talk about housing, right? Where do you rest? Where do you have a chance to lay your head down at the end of the night? And to think about the history of universities and their engagement with federal housing policies is significant, because that is what was happening at the University of Chicago. You saw the chancellor and the other senior administrators adhering to so many racist practices within housing that it just was complete contradiction to being able to enroll Black students and say, compared to Southern segregated all-white universities, look how liberal we are at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Look how progressive we are at the University of Chicago. When in reality, if those students didn't have anywhere to live and study comfortably, then all of that's out of the door.
Yeah, that's a great point. Because I think when I've talked to, students and the university community about housing discrimination, we are thinking of it through a modern lens, which is like, students have asked me, well, did they just have to live further away? And it's like, yes, they did on the south side of Madison, but also we don't have the robust bus system that we have today. It's not easy to get around. You can't just call a Lyft or an Uber and go where you need to go. This poses like a huge inconvenience to students. And at UW, it's not only a problem for retaining Black students, but it's a huge problem for international students. And the kind of failure to act and this kind of limbo puts all of the pressure on students to solve the housing crisis themselves, which, students don't have that kind of power in the city, nor do they have that financial power to really do that. They're just coming from the outside and arriving, and then, they're homeless.
Yeah, Kacie, that's a good point. I mean, that completely ignores when you hear someone say, well, they just have to live a little bit farther away, that completely ignores the reality of the cost of getting from farther away, right? I mean, there is an extreme privilege to live within walking distance to your university campus, right? I mean, that is significant. And that was the issue at hand when you think about the University of Chicago in the 1950s on the south side, to where, there's the Woodlawn community to the south and Washington Park to the west, when Hyde Park is where U Chicago is located. But so even thinking about it right now, just sort of fast forward to 2021, I mean, you can't have the conversation about housing, student housing, and not talk about affordability too. And trust me, I mean, I'm in Los Angeles of all places, right? So the conversation is just as urgent for us as many other universities as real estate. And the combination of property values near campuses make those apartments, those condos, especially expensive, which really narrows down who can afford to live near campus and not have to worry about the time spent commuting and trying to study and go back and forth. Just one of the top issues, both in the past and today.
Yeah, it's still a huge issue in Madison too. I mean, I think part of we have 2 lakes. It's an isthmus, so the land is limited. But yeah, it's an issue that students are still talking about. You brought up President Beadle from the University of Chicago, and there's this amazing quote in your book. If anybody has the book, it's on page 113. But you're talking about the U Chicago students, and this is the quote: "In organizing a student sit-in, you have abundantly demonstrated your concern," President Beadle said. And although he did not like the, quote, emotional sit-in, he admitted, quote, "it had its value in persuading all of us to re-examine our convictions and attitudes." What a knockout quote to find in an archive. It's like something you dream about finding. Yeah. And I think at UW-Madison, when people think of UW, protest is often one of the first things that they kind of think of. It's a hugely important aspect of UW's history. But at the same time, university presidents really hate it. They hate student protests throughout time. It's hate to an inconvenience, right? It runs the gamut of emotions. But can you talk a little bit more about, finding protest in the archive and really about its ability to get the attention of administrators and to almost force change on campus.
Yeah. Well, let me just talk about archives, because that was obviously, I think the historians in the virtual audience can appreciate this, but there's something about being in archives and just finding that one quote, that one thing that really anchors a significant section, if not an entire chapter of your book. So that was very exciting. But when the work for this book, and talking about activists and archives, part of what I had to do was look even beyond university archives, right? There's a lot to be said about not only the university archival record, but what the community says and what archival records are kept locally as well. So that's one thing to keep in mind, because to your question about the ability to make change, one thing comes to mind is the role of media. And that wasn't something that I was thinking about necessarily before getting into the archives. But what became clear when looking at the George Beadle episode at University of Chicago was that university for the previous 10 to 15 years had developed a really tight relationship with national media outlets that were really supportive in the role that University of Chicago was playing in advancing urban renewal, which is the informal name for a federal program that earmarked millions of dollars for property acquisition to clear up blight in American cities. And this is, University of Chicago had features in the New York Times, U.S. News and World Report, Newsweek. I mean, if there was a national media publication, in so many ways, it reported favorably on this sort of ambitious urban renewal program that university leaders were engaged with. I share that piece about the media because that focus for the University of Chicago drastically shifted when students started protesting and held that sit-in in the president's office at the University of Chicago. And all of a sudden, media was, focused on a different aspect of the University of Chicago in its relationship to housing. And that's what put a lot of pressure on President Beadle at University of Chicago, and ultimately the trustees themselves to sort of pause and reflect deeply about what policies needed to be put in place to actually, live up to the changes that students were demanding. And so one thing, I always say this, that activists, student organizers are actually very considerate and very kind, because they usually raise concerns through very traditional, normal methods of communication, be it a written letter, a demand, sort of requesting a meeting. And it's not until when those demands and grievances aren't met and aren't responded to that you start to see a boycott or a sit-in, right? And that's what captures media attention and ultimately accelerates the need for dialogue and the need to create a policy that will make everyone happy.
Yeah, it just seems like that quote is such an enormous tell. It's like almost insider information, because students, I think, and often any organizers or activists know in their hearts that, the quote is direct action gets the goods. That if you go and protest, that's the only way that you're going to make change. You have to be a nuisance. But then there's so often in history, and particularly at UW-Madison, when administrators try and pretend it's not happening. They just, close the blinds and hopefully just they'll go away. But this seems like just such a huge tell that student activism and protest is actually so much more powerful to administrators, not only for, bad media, but just the hassle of them sitting outside the chancellor's office and just, the kind of daily grievance that they would cause.
Yeah, it's disruption to normal university activities. And that's really what it came down to. The Chicago Maroon, the student newspaper at U Chicago, has a couple great quotes and great coverage of that particular sit-in. But there's a photograph actually of George Beadle getting off of the elevator, coming to his office after the sit-in had started. And so again, it just shows having to walk and go around students and step over students to get to the office. Again, you can't help but sort of pause and address the issue in front of you.
Yeah. So one of the questions I've been really eager to talk to you about as, another historian who does higher ed history is, as historians who want to address racism, something that we often hear is that university presidents or lawmakers make the best decisions they think were the best at the time. Or, it's really the excuse of it's typical thinking for the time, that everyone was racist back then. But I think your book does a really good job of showing that there was tons of resistance at the time. When you talk about Chicago, you really use some of the Black Chicagoans who were really vocal about their kind of, they didn't like Chicago's plan. And the same is true for UW-Madison. Like at all points, there are students, faculty, staff who are raising these concerns. And so can you talk more about how you fight that narrative and about finding this kind of fragments of resistance in the archive?
Yeah, that's such an important question because you're right. There are a number of people who raise concerns about racist policies or racist practices real time. We have the benefit sort of stepping back and looking at the past and looking at, seeing obvious missteps along the way. But that would be, we would be doing a disservice to people who were there in the moment. And as you pulled out, when I spent a lot of time looking at local historical societies, looking in those records, that gave me a good richness on sort of expanding the narrative beyond sort of the official chancellor's records or the official president's records that, frankly, to be, a lot of university archives have been biased in what considered to be important records to be kept. Right. So going through every piece of a university archives collection, that's important. You have to do that work as far as due diligence. But it's also just as important for me, at least, to go beyond campus and to engage and say black run newspapers in respective cities, again, local historical societies. I always tell this example when I was doing research in Princeton, New Jersey, that I also left Princeton and walked down the street into a historically Black neighborhood and happened to see someone standing outside of a Black church. And it got into a conversation and they just whipped out a folder of files of information like, oh, here's how we've been in relationship to the university over time. And that just gives me that much more richness and sort of, better framing the narrative around, well, everybody thought this way, in the 1950s. No, they did not. They simply didn't. And community records are well kept. You just have to be able to engage with the community when doing this sort of work. And so there's no way I can write a history of the Black freedom movement as seen through the actions of college presidents and not engage with Black archives in the process. And that was really rich to me. And I can guarantee you there's the same sort of richness in Madison as well. If doing this sort of public history project that you focus on, if you step beyond the walls of the Madison campus and engage the broader Madison community, trust me, they've got a history of the University of Wisconsin too, that will only add to the complexity of the full, truthful history of your university.
Yes, I love that framing that different communities have different histories about this institution. I think that's so important because we think about there is a broad general narrative about UW-Madison and about everybody's institution that kind of gets pushed out or is most well known by everybody. But the idea of each community holding their own is so interesting. When I first kind of talked to you and we met, one of the things that struck out to me as another person who works in the same archives that you were in is the way that you used alumni letters to also give like a flavor of what people thought at the time, because we happen to have a lot of alumni letters in the archive at UW. Can you talk more about like how you use those? Because they really run the gamut as far as like commentary, we'll call it commentary on what's going on at the time.
Yeah. Alumni at several universities, University of Wisconsin included, are very active and have a lot of opinions about their alma mater, right? So let's be clear about that. So they've got an opinion and they're not hesitant to share it with university officials. That's one thing. But also in using alumni letters, let me just say, I'm very I try my best to be balanced and understanding of the complexities of the job of the college presidency. By no means is that an easy position then or now. And so understanding just how many different stakeholders, to use administrator speak, stakeholders were engaging and putting pressure and making demands on college presidents is really insightful, right? Because most often, even when I started this book project, I was really interested in how college presidents responded to student unrest, particularly unrest around civil rights issues, right? But as I continued to do the work, I saw college presidents, one, responding not only to students, but to alumni as well about the issues at hand. Oftentimes, not all the time, but oftentimes alumni and students didn't agree on things. So imagine being the president in that situation. But then not only college presidents' responses, it's very insightful to see how college presidents were proactive as well in this conversation and sort of reaching out to different groups, alumni groups in some cases, and shaping conversations about things that they frankly anticipated. Because college presidents then, and I would imagine now, have very complex networks among themselves. And they were consulting and leaning on each other about how to engage certain particular issues. So at the same time, they were competitive against each other, like they wanted their institution to get more publicity than another institution. But other times they were very much like, I've got Black students protesting. What are you doing, right? Or federal decisions, especially if you're in the US South where there's segregation, like we just desegregated. How did you do it, right? And so again, the alumni letters are so insightful because it gives this nice tension between what the university used to be and what students are demanding the university becomes. And university leaders having to thread a sort of symbolic needle between keeping alumni on board with the university and also charting a path forward or being asked or demanded to chart a path forward. It's pretty interesting when you look at alumni in a wide range of opinions in a wide range of geographic locations where they come from too. They're not just all locally. They're writing from California to New York, writing letters to Madison.
Yes. Yeah. That's super interesting. We just have folders of alumni letters that just sometime we'll have to do something with them. But they're so interesting too. Yeah. And everybody brings a different perspective on these UW issues, whether they're local or not. So you brought up publicity and press that universities often seek. And in the chapter that focuses on UW-Madison in your book, you make a really clear argument that UW-Madison seemed to be very motivated by press and by finding funding, whether that was grant funding or private funding. Two things I think that many people would argue that this still motivates UW-Madison and many other universities. And on page 308, if anybody has the book already, you quote a Black geography professor from UW-Milwaukee who said, quote, "It will be necessary for some northern institutions to examine their motives carefully in order not to seek participation on cooperative programs from a sense of righteousness or false pride." So how do you get universities to really start this reflective process of asking themselves, why are we doing this program or initiative, and how is it going to make the change we're hoping for? And further, I think to really get universities to see their power in local communities and the country at large.
That's a big question. But you know, the first thing, and this is the advice that I give to, when asked for advice by college presidents, here's what I usually say. Is I say the first step toward addressing your question is knowing the social history of your university. And it's absolutely essential to know the social history. A lot of university leaders know their institutional history, sort of macro level, founding date, and this happened and that happened, university status, sort of a timeline, if you will. But the social history of your university is the people's history of your university. And to understand the people's history of your university makes you much more effective at understanding the people who make your university function day in and day out, week in and week out. And that's what's absolutely critical. And so I always like to say, I would encourage contemporary administrators to have a standing, ongoing meeting with their university archivists in the same way that they have a standing, ongoing meeting with their vice president for finance or dean of students or other cabinet members, because this is the ongoing work that university leaders have to do. Because as soon as you understand the past, even the past decisions made within your respective president's office or chancellor's office, you better understand the campus climate at the moment, because there's something to be said about the informal histories that shape your campus just as much as you think about the formal histories of your campus, because students within certain groups pass on certain traditions and histories about how campus functions. And until you fully understand how some of those traditions and how some of those histories are shaped, that's what's absolutely essential right now, to put your focus more so on creating an environment to where all people on campus can thrive, as opposed to being exclusively external facing toward external funding and media interests, which we saw was a significant misstep among university leaders in the 1960s.
Yeah. And I want to give you kind of a chance before we head into some of the questions that we got from the audience.
Okay.
To kind of talk about the conclusion and the overarching really message of your book. And I think it's even more important right now because we're really in a certain cultural moment where it feels like we're being asked and often being more allowed to have honest conversations about racism and about social justice on campus. And so I think the kind of arch of your book is talking about the social and moral responsibility of college presidents to join the fight for racial justice. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, it became clear to me when I was writing the conclusion that after studying the history of university leaders across so many different institutional types, in the process, I ended going to about almost 30 colleges and universities across the United States, Northeast, Midwest, out here on the West Coast, in the US South, really bringing together this full picture. And what I saw ultimately was that college presidents played a notable role in shaping policies and practices with so many racial implications. And so understanding the history and the influence of the position of being the leader of a college or university, college presidents today certainly have a responsibility to make race and racism a top priority in their leadership. And that's important because when we think about just the influence, right, of higher education in general, oftentimes we look to college and universities to solve the nation's problems because it has the experts, right, to do so. I mean, this is what colleges and universities do. It's the life of the mind. Mm-hmm. So in turn, university leaders, presidents, and chancellors oftentimes are tapped by federal officials or corporate leaders and many others because they lead the institutions that are expected to solve the nation's problems. So if you're going to lead a college or university, particularly as race and racism remains one of our top problems within American society, then certainly that means that as a college president or university chancellor, you've got a responsibility to address those problems, not only react to those problems, but address those problems head on proactively in the same way that history demonstrates that previous academic leaders have done so.
Yes, fully agree. Thank you. So I think we're going to go to some questions from the audience. Okay. So I think one of the questions that's on the bottom of the screen right now is, are the archives completely open or are there records that you cannot see? Yeah, I mean, I can answer that for UW. The archives are like 90 to 95% open. There is a small amount of records that I've run into at the university that are restricted for legal purposes. But even those legal purposes, you can challenge them. So we, for example, this is exciting. There is a film about housing discrimination in Madison that was made by Lloyd Barbie, which will sound familiar to anybody familiar with Wisconsin civil rights movement. He made a film about housing discrimination, and they filmed undercover white people denying housing to Black people in Madison in 1962. The Board of Regents found out, was really worried about legal challenges and restricted the film. And it's restricted in the archives until last year, when our digital archivist and media archivist, Kat Fawn, challenged it with legal and said, is there any reason this needs to be restricted? It's been 50 plus years. So the film is no longer restricted. We are in the process of digitizing it, and we are going to host an event with Wisconsin PBS to make sure that everybody can see that film. There are other things I've run into that are restricted by legal that just don't need to be restricted anymore, like they're accessible somewhere else. But I would say the large majority of archives are open. Have you run into anything, Eddie, where like you couldn't see a collection at another institution?
Yeah. That wasn't the case in most places, but yeah, there were a few places I went. I remember being at Syracuse University and realizing that the chancellor there had a 50-year restriction, 50-year restriction on some records. But that was sort of documents created in the early 60s. And by the time I was doing the research, so those records had been open for 1 or 2 years. So in a lot of ways, when you consider individuals like that or university record keeping those restrictions, I often tell people that if I wanted to write this book 5 years ago, I likely may not have been able to, because some universities do have those restrictions, but it wasn't necessarily the case in most places.
Yeah.
So
another question here: what role can administrators play in supporting student activism and carrying forth the knowledge and wisdom gained from earlier activists and maintaining pressure on leadership?
Yeah, that question is really thoughtful. Thanks for asking that. One role that current administrators can play is understanding that this effort that we're in right now to create actual racial equity in higher education and beyond is going to be ongoing, and it's going to be an effort that we're going to have to continue to do, because you're going to have to always remember, if you're a current administrator, think of it this way. If we're trying to overcome centuries of inequality, discrimination, racism embedded within higher education, then it's going to take decades and efforts and ongoing effort to address those issues. It's not going to be this sort of one magic program that you're going to implement, or this one class and everything is going to be better. You're going to have to be actively working to create a meaningful racial climate on campus, regardless of having a major racial incident in the news or not. You're simply going to have to always be doing the work to evaluate and self-reflect and work to move always forward, as you all say in Wisconsin, right? And so that's something that's going to be absolutely critical, is that if you want to support students, you really want to get behind student activists, just buckle up and know that this isn't going to be a 1 meeting or 1 month or 1 semester thing. This is something that you're going to have to commit to. It's going to have to be embedded within the mission of why you get up and go into the office every day. And you're going to have to sort of always evaluate and make sure you're doing the right thing. And what was working a year ago, all right, it's time to take it to another level, right? And go to the next step. Because really, ultimately, what we see in the book is that education is a particularly influential and powerful institution. And so who wouldn't want to be an administrator, right? Leading those institutions toward reaching, their fullest potential as far as addressing racial equity, both on their campuses and beyond.
Yeah, I think the point you bring up about not in response to bad press, universities seem so reactionary instead of really proactive about these things. But I think you're right. It's kind of something that you just have to keep doing it all the time, like just constantly have your eye on it. Otherwise, it's too easy to kind of slip back and let it become something that just doesn't get worked on, right?
Absolutely.
Question: what is your appraisal of Fred Harvey Harrington and Ed Young here at UW-Madison? Did this come across for you, Eddie, when you were researching here?
What did you just ask, Kacie? I was reading the question. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, did this come up in your research at all? Some of the like really influential Black thought and Black activists who came to UW-Madison, or was that it might be a little late for your research?
Yeah. That didn't come up as much, but I will give my appraisal of Fred Harvey Harrington since it was asked, and I leave Ed Young for the Public History Project. Let me say this. President Harrington is actually a pretty interesting character, especially if you think about just how he ascended into the presidency in the first place, coming after President Elvium, right, who was president from 58 to 62, up until a heart attack actually in the president's office in 1962. But Harrington is sort of the opposite of what had been in place as far as university leadership through the 1950s into the early 1960s, because Harrington was actually from the social sciences, being a historian coming out of the humanities, and it was a completely different approach to university leadership. Previously having some people, some scientists leading the university up until that point. And so there was a new flavor and a new energy on campus. And he really was a public facing individual that there was media fanfare over his hire coming into the presidency. And I share that because the media fanfare of Harrington stepping into the presidency and being such a dynamic public speaker, charismatic. One newspaper in the state called him, talked about his physical stature. He was 6'4". He was a significantly tall individual, said he's a big man for a big job. That was an actual quote. And that attention toward media actually played against him when it came time for when the Kennedy administration reached out to Wisconsin and several other colleges and universities and asked them to engage in what ultimately became affirmative action programs in higher education. And Wisconsin plays a central part in this because the initial affirmative action programs in U.S. higher education really were about system-wide change. It wasn't just about considering race and admissions at a certain number of highly selective, predominantly white institutions. It really was about considering race and admissions. Yes, that was one thing, but also partnerships with historically Black colleges. Madison had a partnership with Texas Southern in Houston, North Carolina Central, in Durham, and North Carolina A&T, in Greensboro, 3 historically Black colleges. There were summer institutes. One particular institute was held at Madison in mathematics, I think, so Black college faculty could come to Madison in the summer and get advanced training. The vast majority of the programs, in response to the Kennedy administration requests, focus on creating more educational opportunities for people across the entire U.S. higher education landscape. But here's what happened. For those of you who haven't read the book, you really see how Harrington and several other college presidents on white, wealthier institutions really started focusing only on themselves and quickly backed away from the programs that were geared towards system-wide change. And one particular instance comes up to where Harrington and other Wisconsin officials are upset that Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, an Ivy League university, actually gets more publicity in Time magazine than what officials at Madison thought they should have received for their effort creating programs for Black students from Milwaukee and trying to partner with Black colleges. And the emphasis and attention toward publicity, again, stands out to me as one of the most just dynamic takeaways from understanding where we were once in a moment where we could have seen something else in U.S. higher education. And every time that I look back at that chapter and reflect on Fred Harrington, I think so much about where we stand right now today in 2021, coming off of 2020. You know, I'm not making a clear comparison. Historians don't do that. Completely different timeframes. But what you can do is take on several lessons from the past. And one particular lesson is it's not enough to simply issue statements, but it's another thing to actually be interested in doing the work for the right reasons. And so that's something that always leaves me with this question mark over where we stand today and where we see higher education going forward.
Yeah, and I'll just add briefly before our last kind of question is, you know, with Harrington and I think with Young, there's this photo of Harrington. There's a couple where he just looks exhausted. Like the 60s just wore this man down as the president of UW. And I think that that's true. He reached a point where there was like, he was pulled in so many directions between state lawmakers and the Board of Regents and students and faculty and staff and the Madison community and the national conversation that he's just like a fractured person at this point. And so you see that like, it's almost by the time he leaves, I always wonder if he felt relieved to just be done. And I wonder if many presidents feel that way, honestly. And I think Ed Young came into a different situation. And so it was a little easier to handle in a different way.
Right.
But I think that like particularly Harrington had to deal with like such a broad range of issues. Like the civil rights movement, it was the anti-war movement, it was Dow, it was the Black Strike, it was all these radical thought leaders being brought to campus, whether it was like Black radical activists from the Black Panther Party, or whether it was, you know, the Young Socialists of America. Like there was just so much going on campus in the 60s, and this man is the center of it. On top of, if you think of just running the university, keeping the doors open, people have to go to class. So I think when I think of him, I think of just this really maybe the worst decade to be a university president. It's such a heavy burden. And when you read about him, that's kind of the sense that I get from him. Yeah. So the last question, is there a particular significance for the photo selected for the cover of your book? Great question. Here is the photo I will show people. So you see there's kind of just a group of white students facing off with a group of Black students.
Yeah, no, that's what a great, thanks for noticing the photo. So here, that image I actually found in the archives at the University of Alabama. I was in Tuscaloosa, and it was in the president's records, and it was from a brochure that was produced, that was a series of images from the sit-ins in 1960, the lunch counter sit-ins and other protests across the United States. And one alum of the University of Alabama from 1939 actually got that brochure and mailed it to the president, Frank Rose, and made a plea to the president at the University of Alabama that as the desegregation, the second attempt at desegregation at the University of Alabama came up in 1963, that alum was hopeful that the president would be sure not to have a repeat of what had just happened at the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss, with James Meredith in 1962. In that image of, you know, a group of white students holding a hammer, if you look at the cover, one of them holding a hammer, looking distinctively at a group of young Black students, captures the image that no college president wanted to see near their campus or looking outside of the president's office, regardless of whether they would lead in a public institution or private institution, a historically Black college or a traditionally white university, or an institution in the US South, the Northeast, Midwest, or the West Coast. That sort of potential for violence was very real for any university leader. So that speaks directly to your point, Kacie, about Fred Harrington toward the end of his presidency being tired, looking fatigued after the leadership. It's such a complex moment to lead in higher education during that era. And so that image sort of captures sort of a heightened moment of what university officials did not want to see, which was racial violence on their campuses, either in the sense of physical violence and or the sort of mental and intellectual violence that's also in place when race and racism has a place on campus.
Yeah, I didn't notice the hammer until right now. It
Yeah.
is super interesting because, you know, in the book you talk about Mississippi and Alabama, and there were more instances of physical violence. But I think also when people reflect on the 60s, when I show students photos from protests at UW-Madison, they're surprised by how violent the photos are when, you know, students showing off against the National Guard and against the police, and there's tear gas and there's batons, and like it's a very violent charged moment. And I think that they think that that only happens now, and that there isn't this kind of real historical precedent of protest happening on campus, but also this like this tension of any moment. It's a powder keg, right? Campus is the powder keg that it can explode at any point. And where's the line there and keeping everybody safe?
Absolutely. I mean, the images, and I love talking about images of the 1960s beyond the US South, because we can look at May Day at Yale, Kent State, Cornell. I mean, we can go down the list. There certainly were some tensions as the culmination of so many issues came together with student protests. It's something else to reflect on.
So one final question that's coming from me, since we have a little bit of time here left.
Okay.
There might be some university administrators watching now, or they might watch in the future. You and I have talked. You've actually been speaking to a lot of university administrators, which I think is great. What's your kind of message when you talk to these people? After we were just talking about how poor Harrington is in this awful situation all the time. What's your final message for any administrators or presidents watching?
One thing is, think about your work and its impact on society at large, right? I mean, I gave some sort of practical things that become clear to me from history. This is just me as a non-college president speaking. This is me, someone who has studied university leaders over multiple decades and multiple institutions. The thing about knowing your institution's social history is critical. Then also being able to have a sustained effort, right? Think prioritizing race, not just for one program, but ongoing. Those are some practical takeaways. But in reality, understanding just the significance of your role as a university leader and not only influencing how things happen on campus, but how society at large. Madison, for example, plays an outsized role in society. It is a big university, both physically taking up space in Madison, but also when people think about Madison, Wisconsin, they think oftentimes about the University of Wisconsin. And you can say the same thing in so many other cities, across the United States, that higher education plays a significant role, not only in students' lives, but also how local residents engage in those cities. Again, think about property acquisition and what is it the cost of living in cities. Housing by far is one of America's most notable issues today. It has been an issue in the past, but when you talk about when you think about the disparities in wealth distribution, one of the most notable ways that families have been able to pass on wealth from generation to generation is to simply pass on a home, that maybe a grandparent's home or the uncle's house, right? But when you think about the role that universities have played in displacing so many thousand Black households near campuses, and then you fast forward to 2021, that's just another example to where higher education as a broader entity has made these decisions that have been detrimental to so many people across racial lines. And with that said, I'm always hopeful for the current administrators, because the book demonstrates that these aren't decisions made by institutions. These are decisions made by individuals who are in respective administrative posts on campus. So as current administrators watch this in the future or watch this live right now, sort of step back and reflect on your own decisions and know that you as an individual, despite the bureaucracy, can still push for change and create something meaningful under your tenure as a university leader.
I think that's great. That's a great note to end on.
Great. So thank you so much, Kacie and Dr. Cole, for this insightful conversation. You've given us so much to think about regarding the role of universities in advancing equity and social justice. This has just been so great for us. I'd like to thank our University Archivist, Katie Nash, and our Friends of the Libraries Administrator, Libby Tooney, for making this event possible, as well as the Events Committee of the Friends of the Libraries. Please go to the Friends of the UW-Madison Libraries website to learn more about upcoming events. Thank you to all of you who joined us for this conversation and for your questions, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Thank you.